Hello and welcome to this short talk on the Toccata, Frescobaldi and Kapsberger. Firstly, I'd like to start with a brief biography of both Kapsberger and Frescobaldi, and also an examination of the context for the performance of Toccata, composed and performed by both composers. Any researcher or performer of Kapsberger should be grateful to Coelho for making some valuable headway into the sparse information about Kapsberger's life. Aside from what Kapsberger himself wrote in the prefaces to his publications, most of what we now know comes from snippets, such as this description from his associate Kircher. He writes, "Noble musician Hieronymus Kapsberger Germanus, author of innumerable writings and distinguished musical publications, who, with his superb genius and other scientific skills in which he was expert, successfully penetrated the secrets of music. He is one to whom posterity owes all those elegant graces which are called strascini, mordenti, gruppi, to speak unclassically, applied to the tiorba and lute." Kapsberger died in January 1651 in Rome at the age of about 71. He arrived in Rome after 1604, and with the exception of occasional excursions and travel, remained there for the rest of his life. It is extremely difficult to trace Kapsberger's musical influences, and this is partly down to the lack of information regarding his early life and presumed musical tuition. Nothing was known about him until the publication of Libro Primo de Intavolatura di Chitarrone in 1604. His fame throughout his career makes it disturbing that we know so little about him now. However, we can easily construct a narrative for Kapsberger's life once he arrives in the then thriving city of Rome. Wealthy Roman families such as the Bentivoglio, the Aldobrandini and the Barberini had a great deal of influence on the musical scene in Rome, and it was in this environment of patronized experimentalism that Kapsberger's compositional style would flourish. Coelho goes on to write that by 1623, Kapsberger was indisputably one of Rome's premier musicians. He was certainly one of the busiest, having published 14 works since his arrival in the city. Within another year, Kapsberger's status would be augmented even further, for in August of 1623, the Pope's crown changed heads for the second time in only 3 years, and Matteo Barberini was crowned Pope Urban VIII. Kapsberger was lucky or talented enough to be patronized by the Barberini household, and he was officially given a salary of payments dating from December 1624. Kapsberger and Frescobaldi were non-resident musicians in Francesco Barberini's household. We know that Kapsberger's name is not present on the records of the Barberini operas, and therefore he does not appear to have been active as a continuo player for these performances. This limits his appearances to the Academies that met inside and outside the Barberini palace. Sadly, there are no records of these. Many musicologists consider Frescobaldi to be the founder of a long-standing keyboard tradition. Some go so far to describe him as exasperating and captivating as a musical personality. After training with Luzzasco-Luzzaschi in Ferrara as part of the household of Alfonso II d'Este, Frescobaldi moved to Rome. Claudio Anibaldi has undertaken extensive research into Frescobaldi's arrival in Rome, which has flourished with the examination of Frescobaldi's marriage license, suggesting his arrival year as 1601. According to Anibaldi, the chance of Frescobaldi's involvement in musical gatherings in Rome is high, but not worth overstating in every scenario. He writes, "As to Cavicci's hypothesis, which implies that Guido Bentivoglio hosted well-attended musical gatherings in Rome, it is contradicted by the very fact that music was not the dominant passion of a writer and historian like Guido Bentivoglio. It is no coincidence that in the 45 years of his ecclesiastic career, Guido can be credited with musical interests just at the beginning of his 9-year stay in Flanders. When Frescobaldi's and Girolamo Piccinini's performances as composers and virtuoso players contributed to win him the favour of the brilliant court of Brussels. On the contrary, my hypothesis that Frescobaldi played many of his fantasy at Academies held at the palace of Pope Paul V's elder brother, which is Francesco Borghese, encounters no obstacles as to when or where this might have happened. The Academy of Francesco Borghese hitherto documented date to the very months when Girolamo Organista served at Santa Maria in Trastevere, and there is evidence that they were gatherings which offered a chance to perform before a very competent audience, not only to musicians of repute, but also to unknown ones. Musical gatherings, or academies as they are often called, suggests salon-style performances, far more intimate than the typical concert hall experience of today. The nature of performance in these close circumstances must have elevated the delicate interplay between performer and audience to a communicative level beyond passive reception. The idea that a listener can be a passive receiver of music imbued with rhetoric and effect in those circumstances is unthinkable, and therefore the potential for dialogue between musical rhetorician and listener is overwhelming. Judy Tarling notes in Weapons of Rhetoric that the audience during this period was forevermore in the know, and proposes that we should consider these listeners to have been more like active participants rather than what we might expect from a passive modern classical music audience. In Rome, amongst other notable jobs, Frescobaldi received a pension from Cardinal Francesco Barberini. Hammond writes, Girolamo's receipt of a pension from Cardinal Barberini did not necessarily require regular personal attendance on the cardinal. His status as a straordinario in Francesco's household resembled the servitù particolare of a painter or sculptor, who in return for his pension was expected only to offer his patron the first refusal of completed works. Nonetheless, although there is no direct evidence to link Girolamo's service with Cardinal Francesco's household music, Frescobaldi's history as a performing musician, his keyboard performances for the Francesco Borghese, Ferdinando Gonzaga, and the guests of Cardinal d'Este, his service in the Musica of the Bentivoglio, the Aldobrandini, and the Medici suggests the small aristocratic concert as his preferred milieu. If we assume Frescobaldi was regularly performing as part of the Barberini household, or similar circumstances, then we can be almost certain he knew Kapsberger. Kapsberger was also a household musician and a key part of what Hammond describes as the nucleus of Cardinal Francesco Barberini's private musica. Aside from this key fact, the compositional styles of Kapsberger and Frescobaldi are so alike in places that it would be astonishing for them not to have been acquainted. Now, I'll move on to the toccata as a style, and I'd like to open with a quote from David Schulenberg. The toccatas and petitas, together with similar compositions by Frescobaldi's followers, constitute one of the most eccentric and baffling repertories of Western music. With their baroque extravagance of gesture and freedom of form, they are particularly uncongenial to listeners predisposed towards more regularly patterned works. One likely reason is that these compositions were not conceived as integral works for public performance in concert or recital. They were meant either for service in the liturgy or for the private delight and edification of students and musicians. Hence, the composer's allowance in his prefaces for separate performance of individual sections of certain pieces. One or two compositions even include indications of the alternative cadences which the music can be brought to the halt. Such designs cannot have simply been concessions to liturgical necessity or to the tendency of players to skim through collections, arbitrarily selecting brief portions of individual pieces for momentary playing. Rather, they are an expression of a basic element in the aesthetic of composition and performance in Frescobaldi's time. Superficially, toccata as composed by Kapsberger and Frescobaldi are difficult to define by lineage, although the form holds certain similarities with both the Recitare, the Fantasia, and other preambulatory forms. It is structurally distinct. Kapsberger included 6 toccata in his first publication, Libro Primo di Intavolatura di Chitarrone, in 1604. These early published toccata vary in structure, A particularly unusual example is that the second famous toccata, Arpeggiata, presents the performer with half a page of unornamented chordal progressions designed to be arpeggiated in the technical style Kapsberger outlines in the preface. Before discussing or analysing toccata further, I will set out a parameter for consideration. When I analyse music using the scale degrees or by key centre, I mean to use a deliberately vague term, as Frescobaldi and Kapsberger were writing at a time when modes and hexachords were being superseded by new systems which eventually become the major and the minor, etc. Schulenberg goes on to write, "From our vantage point, we can discern certain symptoms of a transition towards tonality and theoretical thought, such as the emergence of what have been called tonal types in late Renaissance polyphony, or of pitch-key modes in 17th century keyboard music. But the apparently mixed or transitional types of tone organisation employed in music around 1600 may appear to be so only as an artefact of our own view of history." So in acknowledgement of Schulenberg's warning of retrospective bias, I will endeavour to analyse the tonal movements within these toccata with an awareness of that bias. However, for analyses within this particular study, I will utilise the modern system of majors and minors nascent in this music, precisely because these pieces are so important to relate to later phenomena. Toccata number 5 of Libro Primo di Intavolatura di Chitarron A is formed using a structure we recognise in the later toccata of both Kapsberger and Frescobaldi. Briefly, the toccata begins with a simple arpeggiated chordal progression, which in this particular case, they operate over a sustained pedal, first in the tonic and then in the subdominant before moving to the dominant. The following cadence back to the tonic inspires an imitative fugal section which eventually breaks down into a fantasy section which cadences to the supertonic. This move to the supertonic is then juxtaposed with an immediate change to triple time beginning in the subdominant. The original time proportion is then restored and the piece finishes with a perfect cadence back to the tonic. What is generally common with regards to the structure of toccata composed by Frescobaldi and Kapsberger is that they loosely follow a formula that begins with a slow chordal section, moves through several fantasy-like sections, each often using separate or derived motifs in an imitative or quasi-fugal style, and finish in the home key that they started in. They may also include florid scalic passages and abrupt changes of time signature. Newcomb's definition follows a similar schematic. He writes, "The Frescobaldi toccata, like its ancestors, is made up of melodic figuration wound around an armature of chordal changes. The nature of the figuration varies widely from section to section. The essential point here is that Frescobaldi gives shape and coherence to the individual section by the manipulation and modification of this figuration through such operations as imitation, fragmentation, even something akin to what Schoenberg would later call developing variation. The distinctive features of this figuration lie not so much in the figuration itself as in what he does with it. Rhythmically, the Frescobaldi toccata, again like its ancestors, proceeds by alternating an almost asymmetrical, only loosely pulsatile style with some sort of clearly pulsatile, metrically more structured style. Although it may be helpful to use the formulas above as a guide, they require a disclaimer because the very nature of toccata is that they are contingent creations, heavily indebted to improvisatory historical performance practices, and have the potential to be far more whimsical than any categorization would allow for. Newcomb also acknowledges that there is no fail-safe format or description of a toccata by Frescobaldi, but he nonetheless continues to attempt to categorize the form using only the first 11 toccatas of Book 1 and the first, second, and seventh of Book 2. Alongside this categorization, it should be stressed that it is not necessarily productive to attempt to limit the angles of analysis available by limiting the number of toccata studied to 14. Therefore, let us resist any definition that is not vague and accepting of all of the toccata that Frescobaldi and Kapsberger published. Newcomb's refining of a normal toccata type potentially leads us to lay foundations in the wrong places. What is clear from Frescobaldi's published works for keyboard is that he was proficient in the composition of different forms that share compositional elements with toccata, such as the rechicar, the fantasia, and other preambulatory forms. Whilst it is a difficult task to define this kind of toccata form by listing what it is not, there is some utility in pointing out the differences between forms, such as the rechicar, the fantasia, and canzona, which could otherwise be construed as similar. I will restrict the use of the term forms in this analysis, which implies a retrospective categorization, and focus instead on the term styles. The primary issue in separating toccata form with the rechicar, fantasia, and others is that, like a Venn diagram, all of the latter forms may exist within the prior. That is to say, because the toccata is a fractured piece that skips between sections and styles, we could form an argument that proposed that the toccata is only the fragmented assimilation of rechicarii, fantasiae, and other preambles. However, if I discuss these in terms of styles of composition, then this impasse is overcome. Therefore, what is the difference between the styles of rechicarii, fantasia, and other preambles as written by Frescobaldi? Hammond shows how the term fantasia was used sporadically in Italian keyboard sources, and references a diverse selection of pieces. Forming a theory of descent, Hammond draws on the 12 fantasias Frescobaldi published in 1608 to show that Frescobaldi considered the rechicar to be the forerunner of the fantasia. He writes, "Like the rechicars of Il Transilvano, Cima, and the Neapolitans, they were printed in keyboard partitura. Like the rechicars of Merullo, Andrea Gabrieli, Macque, Trabacci, and Antognati, they are arranged by modes. Like Trabacci's rechicars, they are based on varying numbers of simultaneous subjects indicated in their titles. But here, the arrangement is systematic, a set of 3 rechicars each on 1, 2, 3, and 4 subjects. In 7 of the 12 fantasias, Frescobaldi includes at least one triple section. Like Andrea Gabrieli, Trabacci, and Antognati, resulting in a clear 3 or 5-part structure. The consistent employment of augmentation and diminution suggests the influence of Andrea Gabrieli's rechicars, but unlike Andrea, Frescobaldi sometimes defines entire subsections by one device. What is curious about the presence of sections with contrasting time proportions within fantasia, which is a formula present in the earlier works of other composers. If Frescobaldi's fantasia can be clearly shown to be inspired by earlier rechicari, as ably shown in Hammond's study, then it begs the question, how do Frescobaldi's published rechicari, such as the Rechicari e Canzoni from 1615, differ from his published fantasia? Hammond shows that Frescobaldi's rechicari are dominated by pre-existing compositional requirements, or obligi, which are generally thought to be structures necessary to canzone, which Frescobaldi himself realizes in diverse ways. What seems to formally separate Frescobaldi's rechicari from his fantasia is that the latter are not so strictly formed around a compositional rubric and develop throughout the work at the composer's whim. An idea Hammond confirms in describing how Frescobaldi considered his musical subjects as gestures rather than a particular fixed interval series. Although the rechicari were ostensibly composed around a structure, both on a sectional level and a harmonic one, if we regard the use of the hex chord as controlling harmonic development, the fantasiae follow no such formula and simply aim to resolve or follow the development of a musical subject, making the composition of each a unique process. Whilst these two ideas present in rechicari and fantasiae of both rule-based counterpoint and the discovery and manipulation of a musical subject are also present in toccata, neither fully characterizes the compositional function of the structure of Frescobaldi's or Kapsberger's toccata. What we find in Frescobaldi's toccata are short sections that whimsically develop a motif, or explore a subject for imitation, or are simply virtuosic scalic passages that suddenly stop and start again in a contrasting fashion. Hammond writes, "The historical development and compositional problems of the toccata, ostinato variation, and dance were in many respects diametrically opposed to those of the contrapuntal tradition. To begin with, they had developed as the province of the performer-improviser rather than the skilled contrapuntist. Their parameters of composition were not horizontal motifs defining vertical structures, but harmonic armatures given in the variation and in some dances contrived in the toccata, expressed by chords and by figuration in which motivic development played a negligible role. I feel I must initially dispute Hammond's apparent contrasting of the performer-improviser with skilled contrapuntist, as the two are often coterminous. If we were to order these three compositional structures by their use of contrasting sections, we may order them like so. Recitare, with subtle contrasts between very few sections, Fantasia, which often include a triple section creating 3 or 5 section structures, and Toccata, often multiple sections separated by time changes, by changes in time proportion and motivic devices. Rather than focusing on structural sections, Hammond defines the difference between these earlier forms and toccata by their treatment of motivic development, showing that structural articulations were themselves contingent on thematic development. Hammond does, however, describe those structural articulations as unstressed in the Fantasia, elided in the Ricercar, and emphasized in the Canzone. If the emphasis of the toccata form was averted from motivic or thematic development, it poses the question, what is their emphasis and difference? Newcomb affords some explanation when he writes, in Frescobaldi's toccatas, a series of simple and clear functional progressions often underlies and gives direction to a group of ornamental motifs of the greatest surface variety. Both harmonic rhythm and degree of harmonic direction are cannily manipulated to lead shape to the phrase as a whole, building towards its cadence. In addition, the weight of each local cadence, as determined by preparation, voicing, scale step, and rhythmic positioning, varies widely, and is delicately calibrated to the occasion. Newcomb and Hammond's definitions of what comprises toccata form do not endeavour to focus on the sectional appearance of toccata structures, viewing toccata form as either the absence of motivic development or as a set of clear functional progressions, underpinning ornamental motifs. Give a sense of the texture of the form, but they do not recognise common structural elements. This approach to toccata analysis contains assumptions relating to the form's relationship with improvisatory practices, the assumption being that improvisation does not emphasise a coherent structure. Newcomb points out that many of the toccata available in manuscripts, such as those by Macquay or Pasquini, appear to be collections of musical ideas or riffs to be then used for reference, whereas the published toccata by Frescobaldi should be considered a different type of piece, if we take into account the effort of engraving the pieces to be printed. In choosing to contrast the methods of musical distribution in such a way, Newcomb separates the connection between improvisation-ready, riff-like elements in Frescobaldi's published toccata and any kind of improvisatory performance practice Frescobaldi pursued. It is acknowledged, as is acknowledged by both Hammond and Newcomb, the presence of an improvisatory performance practice in toccata form, and that the nature of the fractured form encourages and draws on such fleeting methods of creation, is abundantly clear. Therefore, it is difficult to find Newcomb's personal differentiation between the presence of an improvisatory performance practice in manuscript and published work convincing. What we might compromise on is that the improvisatory elements within published toccata, via engraving, are more formalized. Therefore, these formal toccata elements are different from collections of riffs to be reproduced and reordered in the moment. However, the influence of an evanescent performance practice is present in both forms. Whilst Kapsberger's toccata show influence from the North Italian keyboard tradition, for example, his first book for theorbo was published in Venice in 1604, it is difficult to show particular historical influences within a tradition of chitarrone playing and publishing, as the instrument was still relatively new by 1604. Kapsberger's first book was, in fact, the first published work that contained music for the chitarrone as a solo instrument. The relationship between the earlier mentions of toccata within lute sources is often one of nomenclature, and not of similarity in content. We can only see structural similarities when contrasting the works of keyboard composers such as Gabrieli and Merullo, as with Kapsberger's toccata, particularly considering the Venetian connection. And it is for this reason that it is necessary to place Kapsberger and Frescobaldi within the same sphere of early influence. According to Hammond, both Gabrieli and Merullo heavily influenced Frescobaldi. Hammond proposes that Gabrieli's toccatas contain the embryo of the principal components of Frescobaldi's toccata, but Merullo's articulate a greater depth of expressiveness, replacing the mechanical scales of Gabrieli with more diverse and controlled figurations. Hammond also notes that Merullo's toccata retain the external features of the Venetian toccata chordal openings, which are chordal openings, figurally decorative harmonic successions, and contrasting contrapuntal sections. The line of influence is simple to trace if we consider Gabrieli's toccatas were published in 1593 in Venice, with Merullo's following in 1598 and 1604 in Rome. We can also see the beginnings of a geographical displacement of the publication and development of Italian toccata from northern Italy to Rome over the turn of the century. Whilst Newcomb suggests Pasquini and Macquay as Frescobaldi's most likely influences, both Hammond and Newcomb recognise Merullo, whom Newcomb claims was the first to consider the toccata an independent genre. This sense of the toccata as a genre and not a kind of preamble is a crucial distinction that Frescobaldi and Kapsberger capitalised on. Mark Evan Bonds points out that form can be an obscuratory term, and in its most extreme manifestations, the generative idea of form makes no essential distinction between the form and content of a given work. Nonetheless, Frescobaldi and Kapsberger's approach to the composition of toccata created a sense of design that the Ricercari and Fantasy rarely show. What is clear is that in the hands of Frescobaldi and Kapsberger, the toccata form developed dramatically. Newcomb writes, Frescobaldi himself added the new central section in toccata style, taking from the traditional imitative vocal style and its instrumental derivative, the Ricercar, a highly developed technique of gradual motivic evolution, and transferring this technique to a fundamentally different kind of motif, no longer vocal in conception. The result was an instrumental style combining the extroverted virtuosity and the capricious, variegated surface of the Pasquini and Macquay toccata with the grandeur and sweep of the Merullo toccata, imbuing both with the intellectual weight of the Luzzaschi Macquay Ricercar, but without stepping outside the generic bounds of the toccata proper. It is not particularly clear what Newcomb means by the toccata proper. However, he puts his finger on the nature of the change between earlier toccata and those of Frescobaldi and Kapsberger. They were no longer vocal in conception. We might find cause to argue that this is due to the inevitable effect of microstructures born of varied short sections of the music, which are idiomatic in an improvised instrumental work, and the complete opposite when performed by a vocal consort. Hammond summarises that all these elements, chordal structures in a personal, harmonic and chromatic idiom, expressive figuration, variety of texture, large sectional organisation combine to produce some general idea of the Frescobaldian toccata. Whilst I am unable to configure a secure definition of toccata form, which would only offer a restrictive and retrospective conditioning, I can conclude that by writing in their similar toccata style, Frescobaldi and Kapsberger incorporated a mass of other stylized, and some more so than others, forms in miniature internal sections, which, although contiguous and often sharing motivic development, were intentionally contrasting and short. These multi-styled internal sections create suggestions of separate temporalities through both the articulated motifs that develop progressively throughout the piece, ignoring the various genres that make subdivisions, and the genres and styles of different forms which simulate contrast, seemingly whimsically, and conjure internal sections and subsections. Thanks for listening.